Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, this is the 9th lesson of the Tafseer of Surah An-Nisa. And in the last few lessons we were looking at the verses relating to inheritance. And inshallah today we will conclude looking at those verses. Last lesson in particular we looked at verse number 12, which mentions some of the certain people from Ashab al-Furud, those who have fixed shares, what they will receive. We also spoke about the issue of kalala, and we said kalala is a situation where a person dies neither leaving behind any ascendants or descendants, but leaves behind siblings. Now, if you remember, we mentioned with regards to siblings are of two categories, or actually more than two, but the main ones we focused on last week were maternal siblings. So this is a So as we mentioned, we have the maternal siblings. So maternal siblings, they're a sibling that you have due to sharing the same mother, as opposed to a full sibling. So a full sibling is someone who you share with both parents, meaning both father and mother. So half sibling would be, so for example, if your mother from a previous marriage had a child. So if your own mother had a child from a previous marriage, we said that is your maternal sibling. This is who the ayah refers to. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن كَانَ رَجُلٌ يُورَثُ كَلَالَةً أَوْ إِمْرَأَةٌ وَلَهُ أَخٌ أَوْ أُخْتٌ. So if you were to inherit via kalala, meaning you leave behind no ascendants or descendants, whether you are male or female, and you have a brother or a sister, meaning you have a brother or sister which is, although it's not explicitly mentioned here, akhun aw ukhtun min yeah, as we mentioned, this is, although it's not explicitly mentioned, but we know that what Allah means by akh or ukht, brother or sister, here is your maternal brother or sister, because the full brother and sister, the rulings relating to the full brother and sister are mentioned at the end of the surah, in the last ayah, where kalala is also mentioned. فَلِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَ السُّدُسُ. So if it's the case that there is a brother or there is a sister, then that brother or that sister will get a sixth. فَإِنْ كَانُوا أَكْثَرَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ فَهُمْ شُرَكَاءُ فِي الثُّلُثِ. And if there are two or more siblings, right, two or more maternal siblings, then in that situation, فَهُمْ شُرَكَاءُ فِي الثُّلُثِ. Then they will all share equally, they will all share 1/3 equally. In this situation, if there is a brother and a sister, they won't share لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. They won't share where the male gets twice the share of the female. Right, they will share equally. So if a person died leaving behind no brother, have no parents and no children, then in that situation, and they had a maternal siblings, right, then they will share equally amongst themselves a thuluth, 1/3. We ended the lesson by speaking about a scenario known as the mas'ala of himariya, or known as the mas'ala al-mushtarakah. And this is a mas'ala where a person dies leaving behind a husband. So imagine a person dies leaving behind a husband, a mother, maternal brothers, and full brothers. Right? Maternal brothers. So this is an example of where we have a situation of kalala. Now, although this person has a mother, but the mother here cannot block maternal siblings or even full siblings. So if you look to the chart, for those who have the chart, you will notice when it comes to a father, the father, as you can see, blocks any siblings. Right? You see the father, and then you see the red line, right? And the B at the bottom of that, it blocks. So the father blocks all siblings, whether it be full siblings or whether it be maternal siblings. Right? So in this situation there is a mother. Now a mother doesn't block siblings. If you can see in the diagram, the mother doesn't block any siblings. So in that situation, if a person was to die leaving behind a mother, right, a husband and siblings, then the siblings will inherit. But if you remember, we said when it comes to a situation where you have full brothers and you have maternal brothers. Now, what's the difference in terms of maternal brothers and full brothers? The key difference between maternal brothers and full brothers is that maternal brothers are considered to be ashabul furud, meaning they inherit a fixed share. Full brothers, on the other hand, are considered to be from the asaba. They are the residual heirs, and so they inherit whatever is left behind. So remember, ashabul furud take the share first, and whatever remains, the asaba takes. Now in this scenario, it's an interesting scenario where a person dies leaving behind a husband, a mother, full brothers, and maternal brothers. Why is this an interesting scenario? This is an interesting scenario because the ashabul furud will take absolutely all of the tarika, all the estate, thus leaving behind no residual inheritance, thus leaving behind anything for the asaba to take. So we said in this situation, again, the scenario is a husband, a mother, maternal brothers, and maternal and full brothers. So in this situation, the zawj, the husband, will receive a half rather than a quarter. He'll receive a half because there are no sons or daughters. The mother will receive sudus. The mother will receive a sixth. Right? This is because in the presence of multiple siblings, she gets a sudus, a sixth, rather than a third. Now, since there are maternal brothers, they will also take a share. In this situation, they will take a share of 1/3. Right? 1/3. Because there are multiple brothers. Now, that means there's nothing left. Because the husband takes a half, the mother takes a sixth, and the maternal brothers take a third, thuluth. When you add a thuluth to a sudus, when you add a third to a sixth, how much does that equal? Half. Yeah, so that half you add to the half of the husband, and that leaves you with one whole. And interestingly, that therefore means that The full brothers get nothing, right? Which is what we mentioned last week, if you remember, which is quite odd, because you would think that the full brothers have just as equal in entitlement, if not more entitlement, to the inheritance, because they are a full sibling. You might think a full sibling is closer to a half sibling, right? The fatwa of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, right, was at first, I think I forgot to mention this point. At first, when he passed judgment on this, he didn't actually give anything to the full brothers. And then a group of people came and they said to him, you know, hab anna abahum kanu hajaran aw kana himaran alaysu musharikina lahu fil Like, imagine if, you know, the full brothers, imagine if their father, right, was a stone or a rock or a donkey. Do stones and rocks inherit? Obviously they don't. They don't inherit anything. So imagine their father was a donkey. That means he doesn't inherit anything. That would mean those full brothers, whose father hypothetically is a donkey, right? They will be equal to the maternal siblings. In what way? They share the same mother. They share the same mother, right? So they're equal if anything. I mean, the thing that, you know, bonds them together is the fact that they have the same mother. So why should the fact that one group has a different father, right? Why would that mean that they don't inherit? And so Umar ibn Khattab, he changed his mind upon hearing this, and he made all of the siblings, the maternal siblings and the full siblings, share the inheritance equally between them, right? Equally between them. And that was based upon the fatwa the final fatwa of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. The Malikis and the Shafi'is believed in, and that's why they call it musharakah, mas'ala al-musharakah. Musharakah means that you make the full siblings share the inheritance with the maternal siblings. From tashriq. Tashriq means to make things, to share things, right? That was a view of the Malikis and the Shafi'is. As for the Hanafis and the Hanabila, then they stuck to the general original principle based upon the hadith al-hiqu al-fara'id bi-ahliha, right? That, you know, give ashab al-furud their share first. فَمَا بَقِيَ فَلِأَوْلَى رَجُلٍ ذَكَرٍ. And whatever remains, give it to the asaba, right? Those who are next entitled to it. So there is a tartib, an order that you stick to. Ashab al-furud first, and if the ashab al-furud take their shares, and the residual heirs, i.e. the asaba, take whatever remains. But since nothing remains here, then in that situation, unfortunately, or by the qadr of Allah, or by the decree on the hukum, is that they do not receive anything. Okay. So it's an issue of khilaf between the scholars, right? And each group has their argument. One group has their argument that really they should equally share, right? Their siblings at the end of the day. And not only that, the full siblings are in one way closer to the deceased than the half sibling. And but the other scholars have the other group of scholars base it upon the generic principle that the ashab al-furud are first given their shares, then whatever remains you give it to the residual heirs. But since there's nothing to remain here, then in this situation the maternal siblings, they take what remains. Sorry, the maternal siblings, they take their share. Towards the end of the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "Min ba'di wasiyatin yusa biha aw dayn ghayra mudar." After the fulfillment of bequests and debts without harm to the heirs. Now we've come across this phrase before, "Min ba'di wasiyatin yusi biha." As we mentioned, the estate is distributed amongst the heirs after you've seen to the janazah costs, after you've seen to any debts, outstanding debts, and after you have fulfilled any bequests. Here though, Allah adds a further point. But غَيْرَ mudar, after you fulfill the bequests and debts without harming others, in particular the heirs. Now why mention this, without harming others? Sadly, and this is a reality, that when people are about to die, or even when they're alive, they have poor family relations. And they have disputes about land and about property, and there's favoritism. A person might favor a particular child over another child, or a particular sibling over another sibling, etc. Sometimes people have ghil and spite and animosity, and so what they do is that before they die, they make sure, right, that the person that they don't like doesn't get any inheritance or gets very little inheritance. This is a reality. This happens a lot. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it clear that, that the estate is to be distributed according to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it should be distributed without harming others. Now how can a person harm? How can a person who is about to die, or a person who will die, how can he potentially harm the waratha, the heirs, those who will inherit? Here there are a number of ways. Firstly, number one, before you die, you write in your bequest, in your will, that you will give away half of your property to a charity or to a distant relative, for example. As you know, when you bequeath wealth, you're allowed to a maximum of 1/3. Thuluth, or thuluthu kathir, and even then a third is quite a lot. So that third, you can dedicate a third of your estate, of your property, of your wealth, to a non-heir, or to a charity, or to an endowment, okay? But the other 2/3 have to go to your heirs. So one way of dhulm is, one way you can harm your heirs is by giving, for example, half of your wealth away to a charity or to a distant relative who's not an heir. This is darar, this is harm to your heirs. So this would be haram. And if this did happen, the bequest will not be fulfilled according to what the person said, right? It will be considered invalid, and you can't give 50% of your wealth away to a non-heir. Another way, for example, is before you die, you basically lie and say, for example, all of this wealth that I have doesn't actually belong to me, it belongs to somebody else. Right? And so by doing so, when you die, your heirs won't get a single penny. So essentially lying about your own estate. Right? Or, for example, claiming that you are in debt. So imagine, for example, your estate that you leave behind is £100,000. And you say in your will, I owe Fulan ibn Fulan, some imaginary person, £90,000. So, and that's not true. So that only leaves £10,000 for his heirs. This is darar, this is harm. Right? Or, for example, if you are in debt, if you are a creditor, if someone owes you money, and you say, no, this person has actually paid me back. So imagine someone owes you £1,000, right? So you write in your will, you would write in your will, someone so-and-so owes me £1,000, right? So that £1,000 will eventually come back to the heirs, isn't it? Yeah. But if he doesn't want this £1,000 to go to his heirs, so what does he say? He said, no, this £1,000 has already been paid back. It's already, it's already there in my estate, in my wealth, basically, right? And that's a lie, right? Because he's doing that. Why is he lying? Because he doesn't want his heirs to receive that wealth, due to, again, animosity and spite and hatred, what have you. Or, for example, another way the scholars mention, you have a house, for example, and before you die, right, you sell your house for £10, right? And so you receive £10, and that's it. That £10 is now, instead of, £500,000 house, you have a £10 house, £10 in your bank account, and that's going to be distributed to your heirs. So you're clearly doing this on purpose, right, to harm your heirs. Or, you buy a mobile phone for £1 million. Right, so that £1 million is gone, and all you have is a mobile phone. A mobile phone isn't worth £1 million. Right? So that phone that you bought for £1 million is now going to be a part of your estate. That's only worth maybe, maximum £1,500 maybe, the latest iPhone or something, right? That's it. So these are just various ways that a person, and even they mentioned, even if you were to give a third of your wealth away, but you're not doing it for the sake of Allah. So even when you bequest, like you say, I'm going to give a third of my money to the local masjid, you're not doing it for the sake of Allah. You're not doing it for ajr and reward. You're just doing it because you want your heirs to not have that much, right? And this is harming your heirs, right? And so these are all various ways that a person can intend to harm their heirs. That's why Allah mentions غَيْرَ مُضَارٍ, yani without harming people. And this is why the scholars even said, when it comes to the wasiyah, when it comes to bequeathing any wealth, it is better for it to be less than a third even. Like a third is a maximum. Right? That's why Ali radiallahu anhu, he said, لأن أوصي بالخمس أحب إلي من الربع وَلِأَنْ أُوصِي بِالرُّبَعِ أَحَبُّ إِلَيَّ مِنْ أَنْ أُوصِي بِالثُّلُثِ. Yani for me to give a khumus, like a fifth, is more beloved to me than to allocate a fourth of my wealth as a bequest. And for me to bequeath a quarter is more beloved than a third. Right? And and so the scholars always, you can see there's this sense of not maximizing your quota of one thuluth, because the idea is you don't want to make your heirs poor. And in fact, as Imam al-Nakha'i, rahimahullah, he said قُبِضَ Rasulullah sallallahu وَلَمْ يُوصِي. When the Prophet sallallahu died, he didn't allocate a third of his wealth. I mean, he didn't have that much anyway. Abu Bakr as well. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he bequeathed some of his wealth. فَإِنْ أَوْصَى الْإِنسَانِ فَحَسَنٌ وَإِنْ لَمْ يُوصِي فَحَسَنٌ أَيْضًا. So if a person was to bequeath some wealth, yani he was to allocate a part of his estate to a non-heir, he can do so, that's good. But if he decides not to do so, that's also good. In fact, as we said, Rasulullah ﷺ didn't allocate any of his wealth. Now you might say, why is that there for the sunnah? Yani the sunnah, because he didn't do it, the sunnah therefore is not to allocate a part of your wealth to a non-heir. No, because it all depends on the circumstances. You see, if you're extremely wealthy and you have a lot of wealth behind, and your heirs are already wealthy, then it makes sense, if you think about it, to bequeath your wealth to a waqf, to an endowment, to a charity, right? Because that's, again, sadaqah jariyah for you, it will benefit you, and you're not harming your heirs. But if you're someone who's very poor, and you only left behind, a few £1,000s, and you have heirs waiting to inherit your wealth because they're really poor and dependent and needy, then does it really make sense to bequeath your wealth, to allocate a part of your wealth to a non-heir or to a sadaqah or to... Yeah, and that's why, the Sharia hasn't imposed upon people a particular way of in terms of a particular way of how or when or whether you should give some of your wealth away to a non-heir. As for the waratha, as we mentioned, as for the heirs, they get what is determined by them by Allah, according to these two verses in Surah An-Nisa. So, من بعد وصية يوصي بها أو دين غير مضار, يعني without harming others. وصية من الله والله عليم حليم. This is a wasiyah, a command from Allah. Wallahu alimun halim, and Allah is all-knowing and most forbearing. Now what is interesting is that, remember, verses 11 and 12 are both ayat relating to inheritance. Verse 11 focuses on the shares for ascendants and descendants, yeah, and verse 12, so parents and children basically, and verse 12 focuses on the inheritance of spouses and siblings. Yeah, if you remember that, that's the key difference between those two verses. Notice how both of the verses end. So in verse 11, Allah says not wasiyatan min Allah, but faridatan min Allah. Right? Faridatan min Allah. Inna Allah kana aliman hakiman. So faridatan, so there in verse 11 it ends with faridatan min Allah. Yani this is a duty imposed upon by Allah. Whereas this verse mentions wasiyatan min Allah. And in terms of the difference between a farida and a wasiyah, linguistically, right, which one is stronger, do you think? Farida or wasiyah? What's more emphatic? What's more emphasized? Farida. Because wasiyah, in the Arabic language, related to the word awsa. Awsa just means like to give advice, like to counsel. Like you say to someone, awsini, and you give me wasiyah. Give me some advice. It's not binding, right? So when I give a wasiyah to you, and you say, wasiyati li lak, wasiyati lak, yani, my advice to you is, it's not that it's a faridah, it's something imposing upon you. Right? So that's why the scholars, they say that lafdhul fard aqwa wa akad min lafdhul wasiyah. And the word faridah is more emphatic, it's stronger than wasiyah. Why is this the case? Because if you look at who Allah is speaking about in verse 11 and 12, in verse 11, who does Allah speak about in verse 11, did we say? Children and parents, right? Those ties are very strong. The ties between your children and your parents are extremely strong. And so it is emphasized more. Whereas verse 12 speaks about spouses and siblings. Those ties aren't as strong in the religion than parents and children. And so it's a wasiyah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So we can see that even, subhanAllah, in the choice of words, we can clearly see there is, these aren't words which are randomly, this is kalamullah, it's the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every word fits into its place beautifully. Right? And this is from the husn and the beauty and the balagha of the Qur'an. And that's why Ibn Ashur rahimahullah, he actually mentions as well that one of the wisdoms why it mentions wasiyatan min Allah is because Allah is, because these two verses, if you think about it, you can look at them as one whole. You can look at them in many ways as one ayah. So verse 11, how does verse 11 begin? Yusikum Allah. Allah gives you wasiyah with regards to your children. لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. The male has twice the share of the female. Right? So the verse begins with yusikum Allah, and then it concludes wasiyatan min Allah. Right? Yusikum Allah, and yusikum Allah is a verb in the present tense. And wasiyah, right, is in the, it's a verbal noun. It's a masdar. As if to say that for some scholars, wasiyya here is maf'ul mutlaq, which is basically it's a way of emphasizing a particular clause. Like you say, for example, uhibbul Qur'ana hubban jamma. I love the Qur'an. You mention hubban at the end for emphasis. Akaltu at-ta'ama aklan, like I really ate the food, like devoured it. Yeah. So yusikumullah, yusikum, that's the verb, wasiyatan. Right? And so the end, it matches the beginning, it matches the end. And this is something in balagha that the scholars refer to raddul ajaz or raddul ajaz ala sadr, where the end of the stanza is the same word or is phonetically connected to the first word of the stanza. Right? So the first word is the same or similar to the end of the word. So it makes it as one whole. This is what people do in poetry. Raddul ajaz ala al-sadr. The ajaz is referring to the end, and it refers back to the sadr, yani the beginning. And here Allah says, Wallahu alimun halim. And Allah is all-knowing and He is forbearing. Whereas in the previous ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, Inna Allah kana aliman hakiman. Allah is all-knowing and all-wise. All-knowing and all-wise. Why emphasize hakiman in verse 11? This is the first time now people, in verse 11, think about it, this is the first time people are now going to learn a whole new system of inheritance. Remember, in Jahiliyyah, women never used to inherit. So you could imagine people asking many questions. Why is it a woman is inheriting? How comes a daughter can inherit? How comes a wife can inherit? How come a mother is allowed to inherit? Right? So Allah says, Inna Allah kana aliman. Allah is all-knowing, all-wise. Don't question His decision. And then at the end of verse 12, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Wallahu alimun halim. Allah is all-knowing and most forbearing. Hilm, forbearance, the quality of forbearance, hilm, is overlooking people's shortcomings, being patient in not suddenly taking people to account for their wrongdoings. You're being forbearant, you're being easygoing. Why emphasize this? Because this is a very common area where people fall short. This is a common area of where there is a lot of injustice and dhulm and wrongdoing. And not just dhulm, but also, as Imam al-Qurtubi mentions, huwa halimun ala ahli al-jahl. Allah is forbearant upon the people of ignorance. And by Allah are people ignorant of the rules of inheritance. Subhanallah. Extremely ignorant. These are one of the things that you'll find the bulk of Muslims have little to no knowledge of. Right? And those who Allah has mercy upon, they end up learning, close to a person's death or after somebody dies. And even then, it's very little knowledge. They usually have to consult a scholar or an imam, to find out the rulings thereof. So, Wallahu alimun halim. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-knowing and most forbearing. And that concludes verse 12 and the two major verses relating to inheritance. We still have some ayat, or we have the ayah of kalala again at the end of Surah An-Nisa, but that mainly deals with the inheritance of the shaqiq, the full brother, the full sibling, the full brother and the full sister. And so we'll discuss that inshallah in more detail there. So obviously we've spent quite a few weeks now looking at the rules of inheritance. This is by no means a comprehensive study of the topic, There are many other areas that can be studied, whether it be munasakhat, for example, which is the part of inheritance where somebody dies, for example, before they take their share of the inheritance. How do you deal with that? Right? What happens when, for example, there are many ashabul furud, and when everyone takes their share, it ends up being more than one whole. That can happen, right? This is what is known as awl, basically, where you can have all the scenarios we looked at so far either were less than one or equaled one. Like the scenario we looked at, the mas'ala al-himariya that we spoke about earlier today, that ended up being one whole, if you remember, right? That the husband gets a half, the mother gets a sixth, and the maternal siblings get a third. That's one. They maxed it out, basically. There are scenarios, though, where it can go more than one. Now, obviously, what do you do there? There you have to sort of redistribute, or figure out, basically, another a way of distributing the inheritance. Sometimes you have what is known as rad as well. Rad is the opposite, where, for example, after ashab al-furud take their share, there might not be any asaba, there might not be any residual heirs, right? There might not be any residual heirs. So what happens then? You have to, whatever remains of the estate gets distributed back to the ashab al-furud, right? And then there are masail relating to, for example, people who are absent, right, or people who are just gone missing, right, and they were considered to be a part of the heirs, and then, lo and behold, sometime later they come back from out of non-existence, right, and they claim their share to. So these are the sort of finer masail relating to inheritance, and to study those issues, you need a separate sort of class for that, or a separate discussion to really come to understand in detail. So moving on to verse 13, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ وَمَن يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ يُدْخِلْهُ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي مِن تَحْتِهَا الْأَنْهَارُ خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا وَذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. These entitlements are the limits set by Allah. Whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger will be admitted into gardens under which rivers flow to stay there forever. And that is the ultimate triumph. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ, these are the hudud, literally the boundaries, the markings of Allah. As if to say, this is a figurative way to express the commands of Allah. So when you have boundaries, the whole point of having a boundary is that you cannot trespass those boundaries without permission. So Allah's ahkam are considered to be hudud from that perspective. We don't mean hudud in their juristic sense, meaning a criminal punishment, right? So you have a had like for theft and for zina. These are hudud, right? Meaning these are fixed punishments, right? We're not talking about this here. Had here, hudud means the limits. These are the limits set by Allah. The laws set by Allah. Is this in reference to the rulings relating to inheritance, or everything we've mentioned so far in the surah? Because everything else Allah mentions in the surah can equally fall under this. Yeah, give the women their saduqat, give women their charity. وَآتُوا الْيَتَامَ أَمْوَالَهُمْ, right? Give the orphans their wealth. So all of these rulings, right, relating to orphans and women and giving people their due inheritance, these are the hudud of Allah. وَمَن يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ, and whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger will be admitted into gardens underneath which rivers flow. تَجْرِي مِن تَحْتِهَا الْأَنْهَارُ خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا وَذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. That is the ultimate triumph, right? So this is targhib. Allah is encouraging people to adhere to these laws. But then Allah says in verse 14, وَمَن يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ, but whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger, وَيَتَعَدَّ حُدُودَهُ, and exceeds the limits يُدْخِلْهُ نَارًا خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَلَهُ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. They will be cast into hell, now here, to stay there forever. خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَلَهُ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. And he will have a humiliating punishment. Now, whoever disobeys Allah, now obviously the ayah is it's general. But the context of the ayah, as we know, relates to the rulings relating to inheritance. So when you disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Messenger, and you exceed their limits, you go beyond bounds, and you might say, what's the difference between disobeying Allah and exceeding beyond the limits? They aren't different, right? It's the same thing. When you disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are exceeding the limits. يُدْخِلْهُ نَارًا. He will be cast into hell. And this is why many scholars, they say, because this is within the context of inheritance, this is an indication that not adhering to the rules of inheritance is considered to be from the kaba'ir. It's considered to be from the major sins. From the major sins. That's why Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he mentions in his Tafseer a number of narrations that indicate the enormity of not giving out your inheritance correctly. In a hadith it states, and this is in the report in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, إِنَّ الرَّجُلَ لَيَعْمَلْ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ الْخَيْرِ 70 سَنَةً. A man, he will do good deeds for 70 years of his life. 70 years, he's living a life of 70 years. He does the amal of Ahl al-Khair. فَإِذَا أَوْصَى حَافَ فِي وَصِيَّتِهِ. But when he writes in his will, right, he's unjust in his will, right? He's not giving his heirs their rightful share. فَيُخْتَمْ بِشَرِّ عَمَلِهِ. And so his life ends with an evil act. فَيَدْخُلُ النَّارِ. And so he enters into the hellfire. Subhanallah. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالْخَوَاتِيمِ. Isn't it? Your deeds, your deeds, how are they assessed? They are assessed by your final actions. وَإِنَّ الرَّجُلْ لَيَعْمَلْ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ الشَّرِّ 70 سَنَةً. A person, he could be doing, he could be living an evil life for 70 years of his life. فَيَعْدِلُ فِي وَصِيَّتِهِ. But when he writes his wasiyah, he's just. When he writes his will, he is just. He gives everyone their right share. Right? Everyone gets there. He does it according to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَيُخْتَمْ لَهُ بِخَيْرِ عَمَلٍ فَعَمَلِهِ فَيَدْخُلُ الْجَنَّةِ. And so his final deeds will be from the deeds of good people, and so as a result he enters into paradise. Then Abu Hurairah, who narrated the hadith, he said, اقرأوا إن شئتم. Like, if you want further evidence for this, read if you want the ayah. تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ. Right, the ayahs that we have recited, verses 11 and 14. Right? And so that shows you that, as I said, not adhering to the rules of inheritance and not distributing your wealth according to the Sharia is from the kaba'ir. It's considered to be from the major sins. Now here in the ayah, for those who disobey Allah and the Messenger, وَيَتَعَدَّ حُدُودَهُ يُدْخِلْهُ نَارًا خَالِدًا فِيهَا. خَالِدًا. خَالِدًا means forever. Linguistically means forever. Now this obviously raises the question, how is it that a person can enter into the hellfire khalidan? And this ayah is obviously used as a proof by some of the Khawarij and the Mu'tazilites, who believe that committing a major sin will lead to the hellfire for eternity, or a person won't enter into paradise. But here we say no. Khalidan, the isyan here, the sin here that Allah is speaking about, if what intended by the sin here is kufr, disbelief, because you can disobey Allah by disbelieving in Him, or disbelieving in His Sharia, or disbelieving in His rulings. So if a person says, no, these ahkam relating to inheritance, I reject them, I don't agree to them, Right? You're rejecting, this is, you're rejecting min ad-din, from the religion, that which is known from the religion by necessity. Ma'loom min ad-din bid-darura. These are things which are fixed, well established in our religion. So if a person from that perspective, right, rejects, then yes, khalidan fiha, he will be in the hellfire. Just like if a person says, no, I don't have to do hajj, or salah, I don't have to pray. This is kufr. This takes you outside the fold of Islam. But khalidan fiha can also be used in a figurative way. Right? It's musta'ar. It's a figure of speech to refer to mudda tawila, to refer to a long period of time. Like, you would say, khallad Allahu mulkahu. Khallad Allahu mulkahu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made his kingdom last forever. Do you literally mean that? You don't literally mean that, meaning his kingdom lasts for a long time. Right? His kingdom lasts for a long time. Likewise, Zuhair, he says in his line of poetry, وَلَا خَالِدًا إِلَّا الْجِبَالُ الرَّوَاسِيَ. There is nothing which is khalid, there is nothing which is eternal other than al-jibal al-rawasiya, except for the firm mountains. Are the mountains eternal? They're not eternal. Everything on this earth will perish one day. But he didn't mean that. What did he mean when he said that there is nothing on this planet that is khalidan except for the mountains? Meaning all other structures eventually just fall away, isn't it? Like buildings, once they become derelict, they fall away. Mountains, however, they will always remain. Except on the Day of Judgment. Allah will turn mountains into dust. So it doesn't mean literally khalidan, right? It's just a figure of speech to refer to a long period of time. So whenever you come across an ayah in the Qur'an which mentions a sin, and it mentions that the person who does that action, like for example al-qatl, amdan, like murdering someone, these verses mention khalidan fiha, this person will be in the hellfire for forever. You can even interpret that in one way to mean that this person has rejected something which is clear in the religion and therefore has left the fold of Islam. Or we can interpret khalidina or khalidan fiha in a majazi sense, or in a metaphorical sense, in a figure of speech sense, to refer to a long period of time. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. And then, so that concludes those verses. Now in verse 15 and 16, what time is Maghrib today? We still have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Okay. So, the next two verses are actually relating to another topic altogether. The crime of zina and the punishment for it. So it's probably wise that we leave that until next lesson, and then inshallah, so we'll discuss it then. So we'll just open the floor for questions today. As you know, if you want to ask a question, you can refer to slido.com, sli.do, and the code is Tafseer, TAFSEER, inshallah. Yes, yeah. Yep.
So now, when the husband dies, he cannot share all the money that they accumulated with the husband. It will be like there is part of it that the wife put in the money. So how are we going to decide his money and her money?
Yeah. So if you have both husband and wife working together and they have like a joint account, if it's a case if it's joint account, then prior to the death, if the person, whoever was about to die, gives all of their wealth to their partner, then the partner will be considered the rightful owner of all of the wealth. Yeah? But here you have to take into consideration, are there any other heirs involved here? So if there are other heirs, waratha, right, then the one who is about to die has to take that into consideration. And as we mentioned in the ayah, غَيْرَ مُضَارٍ, you can't harm your heirs, right? So if it's a question of harming his heirs, so he says, you know what, before I die, just take all my, he says to his wife, take all my money, right? I give it to you, right? And so that way his children get nothing, his brothers get nothing, his parents get nothing, then this would be wrong, okay? If he didn't say anything, which is what happens quite a lot, right? It might be a sudden death, for example. It's a sudden death and you have a joint account, then what you should do is estimate or calculate how much of that wealth was actually his, right? And how much of that wealth is hers, right? And you should be able to work that out roughly because you know, for example, how much their earnings are, and you have accounts now, right? You can, give all of your bank accounts to an accountant, or you could do it yourself. You can figure out how much of your wealth is yours and how much of it was actually your partner's that died, right? So, if you can, the one who is alive, if the partner that is alive can calculate how much of that wealth in that joint account is actually theirs, then they could say, look, that share, like for example, £50,000 of the joint account is my money. That's what I earned. Whatever remains, okay, that will be considered to be the tarika, the estate of the deceased. Yeah.
When we work together, we say, okay, we work together, even though like the wife earn less.
Yeah.
She's maintaining the household.
Yeah.
We separate like in a half.
Exactly half. Well, I mean, yeah, there's details to that. It doesn't always work like that. So you don't really take into consideration like maintenance costs and things like that, right? In situations like that, it's better just to go to an Islamic scholar, right, and to determine exactly how to assess, and evaluate a person's estate. Yeah. A question here: is there a limit on how much estate one must have before it is fard for him to write a will? It's not fard, according to the majority of scholars, to write a will. Only in the Zahiri school do they say it's fard. All right. So it's highly emphasized to write a will, and it's even more emphasized when a person is very sick and on their deathbed. It becomes even more emphasized, right? But there isn't a situation where you say, okay, once you earn or possess an X amount of wealth, now you have to have a will. No, because if you die, right? If you die, your wealth will be distributed according to the Sharia. You don't determine, you will write in your will, of course, especially in this day and age, right, where there isn't an Islamic system in place to distribute your inheritance. So it's always advisable to write in your will, at the very least, I want my estate to be distributed according to Islamic law. Or if you don't write a will, just, let your family know that when I die, basically, I want my estate to be distributed according to the Qur'an, and Sunnah. And then, people of knowledge will, the heirs will go to a scholar, a local imam, and say, look, my father, my son, my grandfather, whoever is the deceased, left behind this amount of estate. How do I distribute it? Right? Allah, yes. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Mm-hmm.
So they own a house.
Yeah.
Should the heirs, should they rush to make that asset in liquid so that they can distribute it, or is it a case of conversation?
Yeah, so when it comes to, so if a person leaves behind in their estate property, yeah, for example, it's not a must that they liquidate it, right? They can agree amongst themselves how to, if all heirs agree. Like, for example, all of the shares that we've mentioned, if the heirs decide to rescind their shares, for example, they can do so, right? So, for example, imagine, and this is quite a common scenario, imagine a man dies and he leaves behind a wife and children, and he has a house, right? All the children, they've married and moved on, So only the wife remains in the house, right? Now, most people, right, that respect their parents would just say to the mother, keep the house, you don't want it, right? Because otherwise, if you claim a share on the house, you're going to have to sell the house. You can't just chop off a part of the house and say, this is my part of the house. And so in that situation, you come to an agreement, and that's not a problem. So you can say to the mother, here, you can take the whole house to yourself, or you can look after it, for example. And if in the future you ever want to move out, then we can, sell the house and distribute the money according to the Sharia. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah, that makes sense. If the husband dies first, does the wealth go to the first wife before the children? Yes. So, and if they are full siblings, 3 boys and 1 girl, is it split by 4? Okay. So, a husband is considered to be from Ashab al-Furud. He has a fixed share. So he has a fixed share of either a quarter or even a half or a quarter. In this situation, because he has left, the deceased has left behind offspring, right? The husband will only get a quarter, right? And the remaining wealth will go to the heirs, to the children, right? So the 3/4 will go to the children. لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. The male will receive twice the share of a female. And so in this situation, you mentioned if they are the children, if you mean the children are full siblings, 3 boys and 1 girl, is it split by 4? So in this situation, 3 boys. Remember what we said, لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. The way you determine the shares, the males, the boys, you just times it by 2. So 3 times 2 is 6. And there's 1 female, so that's 7. So you have 7 shares. Each male will have 2/7, right? And the female will get 1/7, right? So the method for working that out is you take the amount of males, times it by 2, and then you add the amount of females there are. This is how to work out لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. So in the situation where a person dies leaving behind a husband and children, so the husband will get a quarter, and the 3/4 will go to the to the children. That 3/4 will be further divided into 7 shares, and the males will get 2/7, and the female will get 1/7. There are other ways you can break it down as well to simplify it using fractions. Slider code is Tafseer, Tafseer. Yeah. If someone is living in a kuffar country, leaves behind an unjust will, is it possible to override it? Well, it depends. I mean, how far you take it, right? So, if the will has been testified by a solicitor, then and there is someone to execute it, well, there is very little that can be done. Right, especially depending on the attorney or the person who has the power of attorney to execute the will. It depends who that person is. So obviously these things will be enshrined by law. But if it's a situation, for example, where a person just left behind a will by writing on a piece of paper, it wasn't signed off by a solicitor, so it might not have any legal bearing. And you as children, for example, you read your father's will and you realize, oops, it's all un-Islamic. He didn't know the rules of inheritance. You don't have to adhere to what he said. You just take the wealth and you distribute it according to Islamic law. Right. Can you refuse your share if the money has come from haram means? What do you do if the deceased person's money was acquired through haram means? Well, it depends what you mean by haram. Do you mean all of it was haram or part of it was haram? Right? In this day and age, people will always have an element of haram in their earnings. Right? But if it's something which was totally haram, of course, you have the right to refuse. What happens if we have taken a student loan and we are not able to pay off before we pass? It's written off. Yeah, if you've taken a student loan and you die, that loan isn't passed on to anybody. It's written off completely. Okay, inshallah. Sorry, yeah, I'll repeat the questions for the. Can a parent put in their will they want to leave the earnings of the property as a sadaqah jariyah rather than selling it? Well, it depends on the value of your property. If the value of your property, for example, is worth $500,000, and your cash, for example, you leave behind is say £10,000, clearly your property is worth a lot more than a third of your total estate. So in that situation, you can't say I want to give it a sadaqah jariyah. The only time it could be sadaqah jariyah is if the value of your house is worth less than a third of your overall estate. Right? So it's very likely this person will be a millionaire. Right? So if a person is a millionaire, like they have £10 million and they have a house which is worth $500,000, not a problem. Yeah, you can say I want to sell the house in my will, and the proceeds go to a sadaqah jariyah, not a problem. That's less than a third, right? But if you have £10 million in total, right, and your house is worth £7 million, and that's your total estate is worth 10 million. No, this is worth more than a third now, so you can't do that. Wallahu a'lam. No, if it's partially haram, if your income is partially haram, then it can be inherited legally by a Muslim. That's not a problem. Wallahu ta'ala alam. I think we need to conclude therefore today, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan. And for those who have come late, then we have a weekly tafsir class every Wednesday at 7:30, inshallah. Please do try and join us, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Subhanaka wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.